Welcome to the program today. Mondo Gonzales here in studio, and I have by Skype Bill Salus, and we're going to give a little bit of a prophecy update and also a little bit of a teaching as it relates to some of the things that are happening in the Middle East. So welcome, Bill.
Hey, Mondo, it's great to be back for part two here.
Yep, and I want to remind everybody that if you didn't see on our YouTube channel, Bill and I did a part one, which in many ways, the title of that, who knows what it is on there, but it's going to be kind of answering the objections to seeing Isaiah 17 verse 1 as a prophecy. And so we kind of did a deep dive in that. And we're going to do a deep dive into some other passages today and give some background. But Bill, before we do, let's talk a little bit about what is happening in the Middle East. And interestingly, it seems like all these players that we continually look at, Russia, Iran, even Turkey, certainly Israel, the United States is a player. There's this proxy war going on, as we know, in Russia and Ukraine. But yet, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened recently that at least could potentially contribute in the long run to what we understand as being the Ezekiel 38 situation of Russia, that whole group coming down for spoils. Let's talk about what we've been seeing in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Right, and it's interesting also, Mahmoud Abbas went up to meet with Vladimir Putin just not too long ago to lock arms with him and to basically entice Vladimir Putin to be the broker of record, or Russia to be the broker of record for Mideast peace and a two-state solution. He basically shunned the thought of by the Biden administration as being a mediator for that process, which is really interesting because he's not going to seize the opportunity that recently was laid out with Yair Lapid, the interim prime minister of Israel, and Joe Biden, who just recently, they both said we want to work toward a two-state solution. So on the heels of that, he goes up to Russia and meets Vladimir Putin to try to skirt around that possibility. It made no sense to me, but again, the theory is that they really want a two-state solution anyway. They want Russia as an ally. The thing with Russia, as we know, the future of Russia in Ezekiel 38 is they're going to put together a coalition of 9 members by their ancient names that we know them today as modern-day equivalents of Turkey and Iran, some of the former Soviet Union countries, some of the North African countries of maybe Libya, Sudan, Somalia, maybe Tunisia, maybe even Morocco. And they're going to come against Israel to invade for plunder and booty. And it's interesting right now that we talk about current events. Israel is about to start exporting natural gas out of the Mediterranean that you talked about through the Koresh site they have out there in the Mediterranean. And that's being disputed by Hezbollah in Lebanon.
You know, it's interesting as well when you look at the politics, the geopolitics. There was a recent, I just reported on this, there was a recent discovery of another natural gas field. You know, the big one is the Tamar, the Leviathan field. Now, there was another one discovered just a few weeks ago. So in total, they're looking at 35 trillion cubic feet of natural gas that is available. Israel's becoming very quickly not only energy dependent or energy sufficient on themselves, independent, but they are becoming an exporter. And so you have a lot of the politics that are happening. We saw recently the 2 pipelines up in the Baltic Sea get destroyed. There's different accusations going around about who did it. But nevertheless, what it does is it strategically positions Israel, no matter what. They just signed a memorandum of understanding with the EU looking to ship fuel down through Egypt and then a new pipeline that would go up through Greece and into Europe. So talk, if you will, a little bit about some of the politics as the upcoming Israeli elections.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the pipelines, the Nord Stream pipeline. There's some rumors that the U.S. might get blamed for blowing that up. I haven't seen that record out on the record yet, so we're talking rumors here. We don't know, but the point being, you know, Europe depended on 58% of its natural gas to come through Russia, and now with these things going on with the Nord Stream pipelines being shut down, and Europe's now reaching out to Israel for natural gas, you could see how that may be the hooks in the jaw type scenario, that Russia may find itself with these struggling economies of its coalition, and Iran's, of course, their economy is struggling, Turkey's as well. And maybe the hooks in the jaw, Israel could become very robust and have the plunder and booty that would entice Russia to put together this coalition and come down and invade Israel for plunder and booty. The other thing, too, is this maritime agreement they're putting together that's been brokered by the United States. Even goes back to the time when Trump was with David Friedman, the ambassador to Israel. They were trying to put this agreement together because of the Koresh gas rig out there in the Mediterranean, and the maritime borders were being disputed, and all of a sudden they come up with a sort of give it all to Lebanon deal here that Prime Minister Yair Lapid signs on to, and he may be out as of November 1st when the Israeli elections are coming on. And Ambassador David Friedman said, this is a terrible deal. All the concessions went to Lebanon, and Netanyahu agrees, and so there's this all kinds of political entanglements going on over there as well. And recently, because the elections on November 1st are coming up, there's a good chance, with the recent statement that came out, that Benny Gantz, the defense minister of Israel, now says he's laid out conditions for joining the coalition with Netanyahu, because just recently he said he would not join the Netanyahu coalition. But if he joins it with his party, he could give the boost that Netanyahu needs to get that 61 plus vote in the Knesset to actually form a coalition. So just about a few days before our American elections, we got to be watching for these elections too, Mondo, in Israel.
I think it's important as we look at the players, at least, certainly we can throw Naftali Bennett in there. But, Netanyahu definitely is more of a right-wing person. Benny Gantz is more centrist. Yair Lapid is definitely on the left side. A little bit more of let's capitulate to the Palestinians, as you mentioned, signing a really dumb deal that would, as we know, the money would not go to Lebanon. It would go straight into Hezbollah's hands. And Naftali Bennett, he's more, again, on the right side. So I think Benny Gantz, as he looks at this and he sees here Yair Lapid is only in power for a short time in this transitional government, is already willing to capitulate over some of these ridiculous economic situation. Benny Gantz, he's a minister of defense, so he understands at the outset. He's a little bit more centrist, but he understands the situation of security. So I imagine that's going to lean in heavy on him to be willing to sit with really kind of a nemesis as found in Netanyahu, which Netanyahu really is a nemesis of a lot of people there, at least in the political government. They don't want to see him get another chance. But nevertheless, these elections that are coming are going to determine a lot of this, at whether it empowers Israel's enemies.
You're right. And, the talk about the security out there in the Mediterranean, it wasn't too long ago that Hezbollah intentionally shot 3 drones over to that Koresh gas rig out there, gas site out there, that Israel, of course, shot down. And Hezbollah came out and said, Nasrallah of Hezbollah came out after that and said, we knew they'd shoot them down, but we wanted to let them know we were going to be able to do that at will, to attack that rig. And then he threatened, of course, if you start producing gas out there without this maritime agreement signed with Lebanon, that they would attack Israel. So Gantz, as the Minister of Defense, was gearing up for a war with Lebanon. So, these things, there seems to be a lull in biblical current events that have biblical implications, but they're certainly percolating. They're not going away. Hezbollah will be coming against Israel, I believe in Psalm 83, verse 6 through 8. Syria, Isaiah 17. Hamas, they show up in several prophecies. And our DVD, we go through all these prophecies, Mondo. You want to tell them about our DVD?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we're continuing to watch is Bill and I did a 4-part DVD really in all the pre-tribulational prophecies, as well as our Ezekiel 38 and 39 studies. So we've done some pretty serious deep dives into this entire situation, looking at what we expect to happen between now all the way up to what we think is the Ezekiel 38, 39 war, which would be the last of the many events that we're coming to see. And so, Bill, on that note, I would love to transition, if we could. We've talked a little bit about the current updates, the prophecy updates, but I'd love to transition into talking about the Jeremiah 49 situation. But last time, if somebody wants to watch, we talked about Isaiah 17. And even there, one of the things that we didn't discuss was some of the prophecies in Jeremiah 49 as it relates to Damascus. So this kind of connects with that previous discussion that we had, but kind of give us an overview of how the Jeremiah 49 prophecy also addresses Damascus.
Right. So we're going to camp out in Jeremiah 49 because we also got Elam prophecy. Time permitting, we can talk about this extra camera angle that Jeremiah had, I think, on the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah and Jeremiah 49 verses 23 through 27, and then we can dovetail into Iran, because of course Syria is a proxy of Iran, so they may be going hand in glove together. Briefly, for the audience that didn't watch that or is not familiar with Isaiah 17, what we talked about is that Isaiah 17:1 says there'll be a burden against Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city; it will be a ruinous heap. And this is the oldest continuously inhabited city in recorded history. Someday it will be reduced to rubble. And we were told in Isaiah 17:9 that in that day when Damascus is reduced to rubble, his strong cities, meaning more than just Damascus, but other strong cities in Syria, would be as a broken bough and an uppermost branch which they left because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. And we kind of ruled out that it wasn't the Damascus was still as an unfulfilled prophecy, because some people thought it might have been fulfilled by the Assyrian Empire in 732 BC. So we argued kind of against that case pretty soundly in our last show. But then it goes in Isaiah 17, verse 14, and concludes the prophecy that at eventime you see him, meaning Damascus in the masculine pronoun, but in the morning he is no more. This is a portion of those who rob us and those who plunder us, which pictures the desolation from the children of Israel coming because of self-defense. They're being plundered, they're being robbed, and this is a portion of retaliation, is what is being said there. But the question comes up about, if Damascus was destroyed in 732 BC by the Assyrians, how come less than 100 years later, when Jeremiah in Jeremiah 43 verses 23 through 27 writes, how come it's shown as a flourishing city that still has a prophecy that has not been fulfilled? And I think we need to look at the details of Jeremiah 49, 23 through 27 as a different camera angle of what's going on with that prophecy. And he tells us what strong cities are going to be desolated in addition to Damascus. This is again a burden against Damascus. And it says, against Damascus, Hamath and Arpad are shamed, for they have heard bad news. They are faint-hearted. There is trouble on the sea, and it cannot be quiet. Now, to put a face on these old cities, Hamath and Arpad, these were major cities in Assyria and Assyria's history. Arpad would probably be Aleppo today, which is the number one populated city in Syria. Hamath would probably be Homs and Hama, which are the number 3 and 4 populated cities. Damascus is number 2. But there's trouble on the sea, it says, that it cannot be quieted. So, and they're shamed. And it's interesting that Israel, there's a headline from the National Interest in May of 2019. Israel is an underwater nuclear power thanks to German submarines. Okay, are we talking about literally trouble on the sea, the Mediterranean Sea? Not too long ago, Israel launched from the Mediterranean Sea off one of these subs a strike against the Aleppo airport in Syria. So maybe we could take that literally. Maybe he's alluding to the Mediterranean Sea. And he goes on to say that there'll be fear will seize Damascus. And it says that Damascus has grown feeble. She turns to flee, and fear has seized her, and anguish and sorrows. She'll be like a woman in labor. And then he goes on to say a very interesting question in Jeremiah 49, verse 25. Rhetorical question. Why is the city of praise not deserted, the city of my joy? In other words, Damascus is going to be destroyed, but why is Jerusalem, the city of my praise, not deserted? Remember, this is the portion of those who rob us and plunder us, the destruction overnight of Damascus, but not the city of praise, not Jerusalem. So find it very interesting that he slips in that rhetorical question amidst this prophecy. But he goes on and says in verse 26 of Jeremiah 49, therefore her young men shall fall in her streets, and all the men of war shall be cut off in that day, says the Lord of hosts. That's military casualties. Then he goes on to say in verse 27, and the men of war shall be cut off in that day, and their young men shall fall in her streets. So you have civilian casualties. Her young men shall fall in her streets, and the men of war. Military casualties and civilian casualties. So that prophecy is not found fulfillment. It certainly didn't find fulfillment in 732 BC because Jeremiah, his ministry was nearly a century later. So I'm glad we got to talk about that, Mondo, because I really think it's important to continue to consider Isaiah 17 as a prophecy that's on our horizon that could happen in the nearby future.
You know, and this is a good opportunity. We talked a little bit about this in the last program, but I want to remind everybody that, you know, as Bill and I and others, and there's a lot of prophecy teachers out there. They're our brothers. We love them. We're all going to be sitting together in heaven based on our faith in Jesus Christ. But we also realize, as we talked about this last time, that there's differences of opinion as it relates to some of these prophecies. And we want to encourage love and kindness, and we agree to disagree agreeably with those that, again, might have a difference of opinion. And so oftentimes what we've been seeing, there's been a little bit of acrimony that's come up, and I'm really saddened by that because, you know, again, we're not trying to hyper sensationalize anything. We're not trying to do newspaper exegesis. We're looking at the text. I'll give you an example. We mentioned this in the last episode, but you know, here I have, you know, Dwight Pentecost's book, and here he talks about in chapter 19, where he describes, this was written in 1958, and he wasn't doing newspaper exegesis back then, but he describes very specifically in section 2 on page 314 that the Jeremiah 49, 23 through 27, as well as the Isaiah 17 passage concerning Damascus, he sees them as being future events. He saw them as happening in the tribulation period. We don't really see it that way, but again, that's okay. We can agree to disagree agreeably. But here's a guy a long time ago that sees these prophecies as being a future event as it relates to Isaiah 17, and specifically as you referenced the Jeremiah 49. But one of the other things that he mentions on this same page, and we can transition there, is the rest of Jeremiah 49 as it relates to what we've discussed many times, again, in the recent DVD series, the prophecy of Elam. So some people don't see Elam, the prophecy of Elam, as being future. They see it as being fulfilled in the past. Here, Dwight Pentecost, again, a great dispensational scholar, sees it as being future. We agree with him. We disagree on as it relates to the timing. But let's kind of give some background for those that don't know this idea of Elam. Kind of give us certainly some of the leading up to what we want to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. It's 6 verses. It's a prophecy dealing with Iran. Iran is also the subject of a prophecy in Ezekiel 38, verse 5. Many of your viewers may be familiar with Ezekiel 38. It's under the banner of Persia. Ezekiel wrote about Persia and that coalition with Russia of Ezekiel 38 that comes down for plunder and booty into Israel. But about a decade or two prior, his contemporary Jeremiah wrote in around 596 BC, he wrote about a prophecy of Elam. And when you look at a map of modern-day Iran, Elam hugs the Persian Gulf. It comprises about a third of modern-day Iran, and Persia comprises about 2/3 of the other central part and northern part of Iran. And they're both subject of latter-day prophecies. Matter of fact, Jeremiah 49:39 says, in the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam. It's the same exact words used in Ezekiel 38 to notify it's a latter-day prophecy. And I'm going to just say about 9 bullet points because it's only 6 verses. We don't want to spend a lot of time on the prophecy itself because it's in our DVD. But for those of you not familiar with it, before we get into the timing considerations, it's important to give a little summary. What happens is in this prophecy in the latter days, the Lord gets fiercely angry. He gets fiercely angry with the leadership of Iran because they want to launch something lethal somewhere we would suspect maybe, although we're not told where. We would suspect if that was in our time, that would be at Israel, because they want to wipe Israel off the map. Ayatollah Khomeini calls Israel a cancerous tumor that needs to be wiped off the map. And the reason we know that that's what they want to do is because the Lord says, I'm going to break their bow at the foremost of their might. In other words, I'm going to cut off their missile launching capabilities if it's for our time. And at the foremost of their might could very well be dealing with, if they have a nuclear program at that time, a nuclear warhead. The Lord certainly can't allow that to be shot into Israel. And Iran, we talked about this in the last program, Iran has missiles that can get to, ballistic missiles that can get to Israel in 8 minutes. He goes on to say, as a result, there'll be a disaster created. He says, I will bring about a disaster because of my fierce anger at these bad leaders. And it seems to be nuclear because there's a humanitarian crisis that ensues as a result of the disaster. It goes on to say, I will disperse the outcasts of Elam. There'll be no nations where these exiles do not go, no nations. Plural. It's a worldwide dispersion initiated by this disaster that happens as this prophecy. It talks about it when this disaster happens, that Iran will have a menu of enemies and they will be dismayed before their enemies when this happens. And it says the Lord will send the sword after them until he's consumed them, meaning probably a military invasion. That's what the sword typologically means in the Bible. But there's some good news, and many Iranians who are converting from Islam into Christianity find comfort in these last two verses. It says, I will set my throne in Elam, and in the latter days I will bring back the captives of Elam. So many Iranians actually are familiar with this prophecy and are very encouraged by those last two verses. So that's sort of a nutshell version, the Reader's Digest version of the Elam prophecy.
So, why don't we discuss, because, you and I have talked, and we believe, Proverbs 27:17, that iron sharpens iron. And, so when you have different views, I encourage different views. I love when people disagree with me. It allows me to sharpen my own ideas and my thinking. It allows me to, again, to look into things that maybe I haven't seen yet. So when we have this, this prophecy of Elam, again, there are those today. Some see it as, some not. But let's talk a little bit about some of the previous dispensational scholars, Bible scholars, that see the Elam prophecy as not being fulfilled, and they still see a future element to it.
Okay, let's do this. I want to get to those quotes like from Wolvert and even current guys like Fruchtenbaum, etc. But the arguments we've got, we talked about this in the last program. Because what's going on with Iran's nuclear program, because of what's going on with Damascus, etc., Syria, a lot of the top guys are being asked these tough questions. What is your view and interpretation of Isaiah 17 or Jeremiah 49 dealing with Elam? So guys like Amir Sephardi's responding, he believes that prophecies was fulfilled by the Greek Empire. Mark Hitchcock and Andy Woods believe it was fulfilled by King Nebuchadnezzar. And I'll give you some quotes, etc. But let's do this. Let's look back at time, because even all the guys can only give it at best a partial fulfillment, because they all understand it's clear that it says in Jeremiah 49 verse 39 that in the latter days the Lord is going to restore their fortunes. So it's clearly not double fulfillment, or at best partial fulfillment. Partial fulfillment millennia ago, which is very unlikely, but that's my opinion. But let's go ahead and let's go back to the Persian Empire, okay? And if it was fulfilled in the Persian Empire, that couldn't have happened, because in 559, King Cyrus relocated his throne to Susa, which is in the territory of Elam. So it wasn't a desolated, deserted, disastrous area during the Persian Empire. The BiblePlaces.com says the city of Susa occupied continuously from the late 5th millennia BC to the 13th century AD. Susa was a well-known historical city. In earlier centuries, it served as the capital of the Elamites, later became the administrative capital of Persia under the empire of Darius, who was between 522 BCE and his death in 486 BC. The Greek and Roman empires. The Greek Empire was between 330 and 63 BC. The Roman Empire was between 63 BC and 313 AD. So during the Greek Empire, Elam was referred to as Susa as well, Susiana. And during both periods, the Elamites actually existed according to Acts 2:9, where they show up in Acts 2:9, come from Elam when at Pentecost, when they come through in Acts 2:9, it talks about in Acts 2:9, they're showing up. So they were never dispersed. There was never a desolated area. Matter of fact, Alexander the Great, here's a quote, Susa lost much of its importance when Alexander the Macedonian, Alexander the Great, conquered it in 331 BCE and incorporated the First Persian Empire. But the Susa weddings were arranged by Alexander in 324 BC, where mass weddings took place between the Persians and Macedonians. And I want to tell you, this rules out the Greek Empire having destroyed and created this disaster, because the Susa weddings, this is in Wikipedia, were massive weddings arranged by Alexander of Macedonia in 324 BC in the Persian city of Susa. So it wasn't gone. Elam was not off the map. Alexander intended to symbolically unite the Persian and Greek cultures by taking a Persian wife by himself and celebrating mass weddings with Persian ceremony along with his officers, whom he arranged marriages with noble Persian wives. So I think we can rule out the Persian Empire didn't happen during that time, didn't happen during the Greek Empire, didn't happen during the Roman Empire. But the argument that's prevailing with some well-known heavy hitters, Andy Woods and Mark Hitchcock, we need to tackle that one, Mondo. That's Babylon. Okay, so a couple guys, we've talked about Andy Woods and Dr. Mark Hitchcock, well-respected Bible prophecy teachers, believe that the Elam prophecy found fulfillment by King Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian period around 586 BC in that window period of time. Matter of fact, they believe the destruction occurred and fulfilled by King Nebuchadnezzar. The reason that, this is an article I've written, I'm going to quote from it. This in large part is because Jeremiah 49 verses 28 through 23, the preceding passage before the Elam prophecy, states that the judgment of Kedar and Hazor, which was Saudi Arabia areas, would be fulfilled by King Nebuchadnezzar. And that did happen historically. So it did talk about King Nebuchadnezzar with Kedar and Hazor. Thus they think King Nebuchadnezzar would also be responsible in fulfillment of the Elam prophecy. However, they provide no historical proof. Moreover, King Nebuchadnezzar is not identified in any of the Jeremiah 49 prophecies. Jeremiah 49, 1 through 6 talks about Ammon being destroyed by the children of Israel. That has not happened yet. Edom, Jeremiah 49 verses 22, that would be southern Jordan. Ammon's northern Jordan. Damascus and Arpath, that we just talked about at the beginning of the segment, Jeremiah 49 verses 23 to 27. No mention of Nebuchadnezzar. And he's not mentioned in Jeremiah 49 verses 34 through 39. More problematic for their view, I want to get into this, is that in 612 BC, Babylon destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh and split the Assyrian Empire and delivered the Elam to Media at that time. This happened about 16 years before Jeremiah issued his prophecy in 596 BC. They'll have to prove why King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Elam in 596 BC, but before he did, sometime before between 596 BC and before he died in 561 BC. Now they do have a quote that they go to from John Mulvard, and it's in his Nations in Prophecy in 1967, and it's a very vague quote. It says, "A brief prophecy concerning Kedar and Hazor is contained in Jeremiah 49, verses 28 through 23. Its prediction of judgment upon them at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. They say a similar judgment is pronounced upon Elam in Jeremiah 49, verses 34 through 39. So that quote goes back to 1967, but that's vague at best. It doesn't say, it does not list Nebuchadnezzar or anything like that. You have a quote, don't you? More of a recent quote that came out from Wolvert about his every prophecy in the Bible?
Yeah. I mean, this is from 1999, page 151. It says, the prophecy concerning Elam referred to an area east of Babylon, known today as Iran. The destruction of Elam was described as breaking her bow, for like Kedar, Elam was noted for archery. The complete destruction of Elam does not seem to have been fulfilled in history and may have its final chapter in the future in connection with the judgment at the second coming of Christ. Elam was promised, however, restoration. So here again, we have a noted prophecy scholar seeing it as being future, but yet, as all of us are, we want to remain humble and not dogmatic. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but we see it as future. We don't necessarily see it at being the end of the tribulation when Jesus returns. We see it at a different point. But again, we recognize that there's room for freedom of difference of opinion as it relates to the timing.
Well, I'm going to be honest about a couple things, Mondo. Mark Hitchcock came out a while back, and he came out and said that Nebuchadnezzar fulfilled it in 596 BC or 586 BC, etc. And I asked him a series of about 8 questions. I said, Mark, how can you answer these questions for me? And time permitting, I will rifle those off. They're actually in an article that I wrote called Are Jeremiah 49, 34 through 39, and Ezekiel 38 the same event? What about Psalm 83? So are Jeremiah 49, 34 through 39, Ezekiel 38 the same event? I get into it and I present these questions. And he never answered them, and I believe that's because he really can't, because they're very, very poignant questions. Andy Woods came out, and he did a pretty hard piece against me because I'm pretty much the poster child for this Jeremiah 49, 34 through 39 prophecy. And when we submitted that quote you just read from John Wolford, my researchers, both Mark Hitchcock and Andy Woods, who both clung to that first John Wolford quote I read, which was very vague, Andy Woods said, well, maybe I've overstated my case. And Mark Hitchcock basically said, well, maybe that's not the best quote on the Wolford quote. So the point being is that I don't really agree with these guys. I think there's plenty of reasons that this prophecy is a future prophecy. So we talked about John Wolford. Here's a quote from, give me a moment here. I want to talk Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. Now, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum was one of the first guys who wrote about Elam and his Footsteps of the Messiah book. And I think it was in December 2013. Matter of fact, I got it right here in my book called Revealing the Nuclear Showdown in Iran, Revealing the Ancient Prophecy of Elam. I'm going to read it to you because Fruchtenbaum is a very well-studied scholar. And basically, it was Monday evening on December 2nd, 2013, when I heard the renowned biblical scholar Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum utter the words that I had hoped to hear. No, it could not have been partially fulfilled in the past. It all has to be the same event. Fruchtenbaum was responding to my questions about could it have been partially fulfilled. Some people say Jeremiah 49 was partially fulfilled, but that it's going to be fulfilled in the latter days to restore the fortunes. And he said, no, Bill. It was interesting because it's like you can see he's racing through the whole scriptures. He's got these things memorized. He says, no, Bill, it has to refer to the same event. Arnold Gavelin has a quote as well. If I can find it in my article, I have it in the article. But the point I'm trying to make, because I don't want to delay the program here, is that there are many reasons why, and I'm going to give you some of them right here, why they're not the same prophecies. The prophecies that was not fulfilled. The prophecies referred for in the latter days, Jeremiah 49 verses 39. Babylon is mentioned 141 times in Jeremiah's books, but not mentioned once in this prophecy. The conquest of Elam in 612 BC by Babylon is 16 years prior to the issuance of this prophecy. Nebuchadnezzar never did conquer it again. Elam needs no restoration. If it was fulfilled back by there was a partial exile 2 millennia ago, and Elam needs to be restored. Well, that doesn't need to be restored right now. It will need to be restored if the prophecy gets hit pretty soon. And who are the returning captives? It says, I'll bring back the captives. The Elamites appear in Ezra 4:9, after Babylon's situation. That was after Esther. Acts 2:9, that's at the time of Pentecost. They show up in Isaiah 11:11, Elamites coming back, gathered out of Elam from the nations of the world into Israel. When was the Lord fiercely angry with Elam historically? He's angry with them right now because of the rogue regime. Who are the enemies of Elam when the Lord is fiercely angry? What nations did the Elamites get dispersed into 2,500 years ago? These are all part of that article that I just quoted off. Now, some people might say that Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49 are the same prophecies. But the article I point out, and by the way, these are all on our DVD. I point out that they're different prophets, which is not a big deal. Sometimes you can have two prophets. We just talked about Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah 49 talking about different camera angles on Damascus. But there were different prophets. The prophecies take place in different geographical locations. The disaster occurs on Elam in Iran. The destruction of Persia and the Gog and Magog invaders in Ezekiel 38 is on the mountains of Israel. There are different battlefields. We just talked about Iran versus Israel. Different defeats. The Lord's going to send the sword after Elam until they're defeated and they'll be dismayed before their enemies. But God stops Ezekiel 38 and 39 supernaturally with a great earthquake, fire, hailstone, and flooding rains. It's interesting, Ezekiel omits Elam and his invaders. He's very descriptive about who he's involved in Ezekiel 38. And he knew about Elam. He talks about Elam in Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 24 through 25. But I believe he intentionally omits Elam, Ezekiel 38 among the invaders, because I don't believe Elam is involved. I think Elam gets the prophecy fulfilled before. And there's no promise of restored fortunes for Persia. So those are reasons why I don't think that you can compare Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49 and Elam together.
So, when we think about this, we're recognizing that there are a variety of scholars, especially some that are older. Like, Arno Gaebelein is a very well-known. I have several of his commentaries. From 1922, his annotated Bible. So this is where, when you look at the modern discussion, some people see it, some people don't, and that's fine. Again, we're all brothers, and we're going to agree to disagree agreeably. But, as we look forward, we see something. Arno says this: the final prediction in this Jeremiah 49 passage is as to Elam. Elam was east of South Babylonia and the lower Tigris, later known as Susians. This prophecy was given at the beginning of Zedekiah's reign. Elam became an ally of the Persian kingdom. Her overthrow is foretold, as well as her restoration in the latter days. So he clearly sees this in 1922 as something that had not happened yet. And so for us, as we're looking at the prophetic scenario, again, we spent 4 hours on this, but we're watching the events, we're looking at the current situation, and we're recognizing, again, we're not creating our theology based on current events, because obviously we agree here 100 years ago, he saw this as a future event from an exegetical perspective also.
Correct. And so as we kind of summarize this out, if Damascus, Isaiah 17, and Jeremiah 49, 23 through 27 remain unfulfilled, and if they're about to happen, and if Jeremiah 49 verses 34 through 39 remains unfulfilled, and if it's about to happen, those two countries, Syria and Iran, are in lockstep with each other. Syria is Iran's proxy. And these are powerful events. Recently, in May of 2022, Israel conducted one of their largest simulated military drills, simulating the striking of Iran and their nuclear facilities, and it was called the Chariots of Fire drill. And it was a very serious drill. It also encompassed preparing for a proxy war coming against them from all sides, a multi-front war. It also prepared for casualties inside of Israel. So we're talking about prophecies that probably haven't found fulfillment, that could happen side by side, and then they could lead to bigger prophecies after that. We're talking about biblical prophecies that actually you could experience even during the church age, because in our DVD we point out these are actually pre-tribulation prophecies. They appear to be. So, we're encouraging you to not discount these as already being fulfilled, just because some people have said they were fulfilled by Nebuchadnezzar or the Assyrian Empire. We've tried to present the arguments why you should keep them front and center and be watching for these things, because you can evangelize through these things as well. When people start talking about Iran's nuclear program, you say, Iran is the subject of Bible prophecies in Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49. Did you know that the future can actually be known about Iran? And Damascus has a bleak future ahead of it. Syria, Israel's been striking around Damascus over the last few years. And then people go, where are you hearing all this stuff? And you go, well, I don't just get caught up in the fake news, secular worldview, and the censored social medias. I follow the biblical narrative and the prophetic perspective because the Word of God says these things, and we can understand this stuff from the Word of God. So I would say keep these things on your radar. I certainly am. It looks like Mondo is too.
Yeah, amen, Bill. I mean, we're kind of standing on the predecessors that didn't have the advantage that we do at looking out at current events. I mean, 1922, again, you have Dwight Pentecost in 1958. They all saw these as being future. And I appreciate that they're looking at it and saying, well, when we look out, we don't see it in the news. You and I get the opportunity to try to look at the current situation and again, to rest and to stand on the shoulders of those that have come before us. And so we appreciate you watching today. Bill, always appreciate your time. We're getting into the nitty gritty and we're doing a deep dive on all this. And the goal, as Bill said, is to evangelize. It's meant to look at the scripture, look at those who have come across, to do good, solid biblical exegesis, but also we do it with the spirit of love. And if people disagree, that's great. That's okay. Iron sharpens iron. That's really the point. And we want to continue to share, again, the good news and to do it in a way that is, again, loving and kind and represents Jesus well. So we appreciate you watching this update. If you didn't see the other one, go back and find that one where we discuss Isaiah 17. And also, if you want the full-blown deep dive, you can see our pre-tribulational 4-hour DVD as well as what we did on the Ezekiel 38. So as always, we're educators. We want to educate you. We want to do the deep dives for you to give you the background, lots of slides and presentations and everything else. So I appreciate you watching today, and we will see you next time.